Nathalie Mezza-Garcia, and welcome to the Floating Cities Show. Here, you'll learn about the latest floating projects, developments, houses, buildings, neighborhoods, floating city plans, and the regulations, zones, and jurisdictions that enable them all across the world. You'll hear directly from the makers, the architects, designers, developers, engineers, and even the regulators that make floating projects possible. Come join me while together with Seaphia, we help you navigate the complexity of these new waters. Hello everyone, I'm here with Richard Coutts from Baca Architects, who's going to talk to us today about his amphibious and floating projects. How are you, Richard?
Hello, well, many thanks for joining me on this call. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks for thanks for being here. So I really have a deep look at your website, and I'm very impressed with the work that Bacca does. So can you talk to us a bit about what your firm does and what is your approach to, well, what you bring to the designs that other firms don't?
Well, certainly. So for the last decade or so, we've been working in the field of flood mitigation. And that was born out of a project which we initially looked at as a competition. It was in Manchester. Okay. And we were just students at the time. And we thought, well, how do we differentiate ourselves from the competition? So it's on the River Irwell in Manchester. The site would have been very heavily influenced by flooding. So we thought, well, most people will build a flood defence around the building, put it up on a podium, and build something quite traditional on top. So we thought, well, that's not really going to differentiate ourselves from our market. Mm-hmm. So we thought, well, what might happen if we allow water in? So a lot of our work is a non-defensive approach to flooding. So that sort of works on the premise that governments can't afford to keep maintaining very expensive flood defences. And it also works very much with landscape. And in the event that you can't place a building somewhere safely within the landscape, then architecture, or as we call it, aquatecture, steps in and takes over. So the scheme in Manchester, it started off with, well, what happens to your car in a flood? And where do your electrics go? And how do I get safely to and from my front door? And how does that work if I'm a woman with a pushchair, or if I'm a person with a wheelchair? And so that started to raise questions, and we realized we couldn't answer that at a building level. So we started to do sketches to say, well, could we solve that at a community level? And before we knew it, we developed what we call the concept city, where my colleague and I, we drew a city for 40,000 people. And we realized that you needed to resolve this at a policy level, at a community level, and eventually at a building level. Yeah. And you mentioned flooding, but what's interesting now is during the last sort of decade, you know, the discussions about climate change and the frequency of flooding is in everybody's minds. Yeah. And probably in the last 10 years, there's been a major flood event somewhere in the world. I mean, 29 out of the 39 largest cities, so that's populations of over 5 million, are next to or are within 100 kilometers of the coast. Yeah. So all of those major conurbations, some of those very wealthy cities, some of those developing, and some of those struggling. And as we saw recently in Nepal and India, you know, there's very severe floods affecting everybody. So our premise is, how can we create safe, beautiful places to live? Because ultimately, I'm an architect and an urban designer. How do we deal with having to build new homes? I mean, I was talking with a colleague yesterday who was very proud that he just bought himself a new electric car. But what he failed to realize is that he was paving over his front garden to enable the car to be charged against his property. Now, the consequence of that is, if everybody paves over their gardens in suburbia or urban cities, is an increase in surface water flooding. So our approach is holistic. Where do we make space for water? How do we get landscaping within our development so that urban heat island effect, people who look out of their windows, if you're trapped in a small flat during COVID, you've got something beautiful to look at. And then finally, can we make something which is warm, comfortable, and flood resilient?
Yeah. So what is the difference between an amphibious building and a traditional floating building? I say traditional, though the field is still developing, but what is the difference between these two types of approaches?
So at the most basic level, a floating home sits in the watercourse. So whether it's a dock, a canal system, or a river, whereas an amphibious house is actually land-bound. It sits in from the watercourse. And for all intents and purposes, during its everyday life, it's a normal home. Now, the benefit of that property means that the ground level, so typically your lounge, your kitchen area, that's close to the garden. But below the property, it's like a basement, and we call it the displacement element, and that allows the building to float through Archimedes' principle. So in the event of a flood, the ground slowly swells with water. That provides buoyancy to the building, and the building gently raises, keeping its occupants at a safe distance. And probably the next question you're going to ask me, well, how do the utilities work? So people go, well, that's great, but how do I have electricity? How do my toilets flush? So we have a thing called elephant connections, and it's very much like, a trunk of an elephant. Okay. And they sit between the building and the dock that it sits in. So it sits within a little mini dock. And when the building rises, the cables are designed to be sufficiently long enough to stretch.
Okay, like an elephant thing. Okay. So would this happen does this happen at the level of the house or the neighborhood?
Oh, so that's a very good question. It can happen at both. So the amphibious house, which probably most people know us for, which is the one in Buckinghamshire in England, that's an individual property. So that is individually connected to the foul sewage, the water, and electricity. In Boston, in the Hudson Harbour there, we're looking with colleagues called Water Studio in the Netherlands, we're looking at developing a floating neighbourhood. And those properties are clustered in groups of about 20 units. And so it's just a bigger version of the amphibious unit. And again, they can rise and fall about 7 meters with the tidal water range within the, let's say, within the harbour there.
That's a lot. That's really, you can withstand almost all levels of floating with 7 meters, really.
Yeah.
So I was born in a city in the north coast of Colombia that suffers from extreme flooding because the city didn't have an underwater sewage system, or for when it rains. Sorry, not sewage, but for when it rains, right? So my memories from when I was a girl is the whole city flooded and mattresses and things just being brushed away. So I'm very happy to see how all these approaches are emerging for new cities and new developments to not have to come up with ways to live against nature, but with nature, right?
I think that's one of the important strategies that humans now need to embrace. We've sort of tried to almost control nature, but now we need to work with nature and respect it more. Our future is dependent on how well and how healthy our planet is, and we need to understand its natural processes. I say one of the sort of main mantras of our work is making space for water. And with the students that I teach, or within the members of staff within our office, urban planning doesn't normally address water initially. Yeah. A developer will say, what's my area in terms of acres or hectares? How many houses can I get on there? And since the 50s, it's mainly been how much space do we need for parking and for roads.
Yes.
And then perhaps, at the turn of the century, we started to look at solar design, so roofs orientated south. But, things like space for water, so whether it's sustainable urban drainage, they've always been pushed to the extremities of a property or a site. So we sort of say, embrace water as a friend rather than a foe, and to design that actually within the heart of the development. And you can use that then, so people get wonderful views into what would be a park area. That park can double as storm storage during, flashy floods or very heavy downpours of rainfall. So it can provide the storage.
Okay.
And, you can use those for parks for children, but it gives you space as well between properties. So we need to it's a more of a multifunctional approach rather than saying this area is specifically for this or for growing crops. There's a lot of human beings on this planet, and we need to preserve those green areas outside of our cities. So within those dense conurbations, we need to, on our buildings, either bioclimatic design, so greening the facade, slowing the water down, getting into the natural environment, using that green space to help with urban heat island effect. But it can also be used as well to filter the water and to clean it. So if you have a utility company who are adopting the swales, the parks, those can be natural filtration systems, slowing water down, getting into the built environment. And then ultimately, it's clean water when it reaches the pumping station or the treatment. So again, it's all of these overlapping systems, and we live in an ecosystem. Mother Nature doesn't work as this is my small spot and this is yours. We have to work together. And I think as architects and urban designers, as policymakers, as engineers, as landscape designers, as we need to start to understand each other's disciplines, and as we start to overlap, as I say, we'll work more in tune with nature and equally create some really wonderful and sustainable places to live.
You could have not said it better. So I'm interested about the landscaping aspect of the amphibious homes. So how is the landscaping similar or different from traditional homes on land? Do you have to plant plants that are different and that can withstand large amounts of water, or maybe you receive flooding from the ocean? That sounds more like a tsunami, but if it's salt water, then you have to use mangroves instead of oak trees. So the landscaping, what different factors come into play that with traditional building on land don't?
No, indeed. So it depends where you are in the world. So if you were in somewhere like New Orleans, the depletion of the mangroves has been a huge discussion point in terms of how weather and hurricanes are controlled in the Gulf of Mexico. In the River Thames, we're dealing with fresh water, but if you move out to a coastal situation, then you'll also need to deal with salt water. So at the Amphibious House, one of the interventions that we've done there, so if you consider sort of how rice fields are designed in sort of India,
Yes.
so in the sort of plateaus, we've created a series of plateaus in front of the Amphibious House, and that's twofold. One, we have different planting regimes at different levels, so that's dependent on how frequent the site will flood, and we have more hardy plants in the areas where it will be inundated with water more frequently. But the reason for the terraces, and it's similar to a much larger scheme which we've designed for the city of Paris, whereby these terraces act as early warning systems. So instead of, for example, building a flood defence and the water rises slowly, overtops and surprises people behind, the idea with the plateaus is that as a homeowner, you get to see that plateau 1 or 2 are filled with water. And by the time it gets to plateau 3, because it's designed to be linked to the wet dock of the Amphibious House should start to rise by the time flood plateau 3 has been inundated with water. So it also becomes an early warning system.
Yeah.
I mean, we kind of, I mean, it's interesting because, for example, there are lots of other sort of very clever landscape interventions that you could do. So, for example, in St. Mark's Square in Venice, they have little isthmus. So most people think that the square is flat, but actually there's these little raised ridges that run through the square. So when it starts to flood at a very low level, it leaves these slightly elevated footpaths that weave their way through the site. So depending on whether it's a neighborhood, a square, or a city, there's lots of very subtle interventions we can do, whether they're hard landscaping, so to create safe routes in and out of the city. We can create landscaping to absorb the water and actually create something attractive, which will also then absorb and slow and contain. So there's lots of different strategies, but those working together with the architecture, that's the holistic solution which we need if we're going to improve our response and our resilience to major floods.
And that's what I've seen that you bring to the table as Baca Architects, right? Cool.
No, exactly. I mean, we've been working in the field now for just over 10 years. And I mean, I'm calling today from my home studio, and you'll see a lot of the drawings in the background, which were drawn very quickly during lockdown. But
I love it. Cool office, by the way.
No, thank you very much. No, it's to say as a studio, as I say, a bit of an aside, all of our architects love to draw. And so instead of being entirely dependent on computers, we're going back to some of the more natural skills, because there's an immediacy there. And when you're sat with clients or students or colleagues, being able to draw and articulate your vision through a drawing is a very effective and efficient way of working.
It's really telling that you mentioned going back to ways in which things were done before, and how this can work sometimes better than current practices in some aspects. Because when you were talking about the little hills or the different tier levels of that the landscaping of the flood system uses, I was thinking about how an indigenous community used to manage floods in the north part of Colombia about 500 years ago. And they were able to grow their crops and use the natural rhythms of the flood season and the dry season in favor of their crops, and they had no problem. But the farmers who live there right now don't have the same relation with water. So when the area gets flooded, they have no business, instead of living with it as it was used, as they used to do in the past. So yeah, I like that. And I've seen some of the drawings that you have on the website, and I'm very, I can see so I want to talk about the floating sanctuary, which is one of the projects that I saw that called my attention the most. So can you tell us a bit about the floating sanctuary? Why the shape? What is this project?
So interestingly, so here is the actual original concept drawing.
This is the original one.
Yes, so let me just, I will liberate it from my collection. But what you'll see in my studio, there's lots of bulldog clips.
Okay.
And within here are all of the original sketches and designs. So this is the original drawing.
That's the one that's gonna be sold on eBay in 20 years from now.
Exactly. And the other one which are in here, the original sketches for the Underwater Discovery Centre in Australia. Yeah. So here we go. This is just some of these. So these are genuine drawings from.
Oh, wow.
There we go. No, so talking about the origins of the water lily. Yeah. So this is the original sketch of the water lily. And this was born out of some quite unusual site constraints. So originally the design for the lake was to have almost like a daisy chain or a necklace of lodges that went around the lake. But for one reason or another, the southern part of the lake, there were some serious site constraints. So we just weren't able to provide those sort of houses with the area, but the client needed a critical mass of development to pay for the whole scheme. So we looked at, well, how could we blend all of these units together? And we looked at the sun path, we looked at flows, we looked at, equally, we needed something that was very close and low to the water, but would have a fantastic silhouette. And we did lots of different, thank you, and it has lots of just different, it's going to be viewed from many different directions. And also, it's not far from an airfield, so people will fly over the site.
Oh, cool. Okay.
So we just started to have a look at just different ways and different shapes. And the first generation were really quite conservative. And as an aside, as an aside, that the client just saw the sketch of the water lily and he just said, "I love it."
Cool.
So he gave us the confidence to develop it further, and literally from when we drew it to when it was published, it's now circulated all over the globe, and it's, I say, it's one of the most visited pages on our website, and it's probably how you came to find us as well.
Yeah, so I actually came to find you because I was living in the UK for like 3-4 years when I was doing my PhD, and I received lots of alerts of what's going on in the space, and Bacca Architects was always there, but I was busy, so I didn't really have time to focus on anything that wasn't the PhD. But I knew, I was so happy when I saw that there was amphibious or floating work being done in the UK, because I wasn't aware before you. So yeah, cool, nice. And how about the underwater ocean discovery? Because this is a different approach. It's not floating, it's not amphibious, it's underwater. So can you talk to us, can you tell us a bit also about the Discovery Center and, well, how would it be built, basically?
Well, we're very lucky to be working with some of the best engineers in the world, and also some submarine engineers. And so they came in to visit us at our office, and we were just talking about projects and potential collaborations. And they identified an opportunity in Australia where we might be able to collaborate together. So the site itself is in an area called Busselton. So the nearest city to that is Perth. So it's on the west coast of Australia. So it's exposed very much to all of the sea to the west of Australia. And they have a jetty there, which is it's a Victorian era jetty. It's about 2 kilometers long, which just goes out to sea. And at the end of the jetty is the Busselton. Essentially, it's a marine ecology and education centre at the end of the pier. And so it's an exhibition space, but also provides education to children, and also a monitoring station for sea life within the ocean floor. And they wanted to create a visitor attraction, but also an education centre, which would act as an anchor point at the end of the pier. Visitors could then go and then take the journey from surface level slowly to underwater, and then at ocean floor level to see this wonderful panoramic view of the coral and of the sea life at the ocean floor. So we were very much involved in that. We developed the concept design. They're just in the process of developing the construction drawings for that. But it's the same team that delivered the under restaurant, so Snoetta's design in Norway.
One of the things that I like the most about the underwater center is that it has an aquarium, but it's not the aquarium that kidnaps the animals and puts them in a water jail. It's an aquarium where people go and visit the species who live there in their real, just living their normal life. So
It's almost like an inverse, because it's the humans
yeah,
that are
yeah,
contained within inside the vessel. But I
yeah.
mean, it's going to be really quite inspiring, particularly for young children as well, because I think they're going to organise it so that children can almost camp and sleep within the. So they'll have weekends where children can go and do a sleepover on the ocean floor. So if you're if you're a child in
Wow.
6, 7, 8 years of age, and some of your early memories are a stingray floating through the water in
Wow.
a beautiful blue space, and those teachers explaining to you how sensitive and how we must care for the ocean. That will be very inspiring, because we do need the next generation of humans to take care of this planet. So yeah, the design of that
A
was
whale.
in, well, we call it the cetacean, which is a mythical ocean beast. The design itself went through a number of guises. It started off as a rock.
Oh, okay.
So the original design was a rock at the end of the pier, and
Okay.
then we were asked to consider designing it as a pirate ship.
Okay.
And then through the consensus through the people who are running the visitor centre, and the contractors and the designers and the government, the idea which everybody settled on was the cetacean. And I think the eye which looks out over the ocean, where as you spiral down through the property, you go from daylight down through the different stratas of the ocean, is a very compelling vision. And I think it's what a lot of people bought into. And the city also wanted something very iconic, very memorable. And as I say, if you just type in Bacca Architects whale into the internet, I don't think you'll find anything else. So yeah, so if you type that into the internet, it kind of monopolizes all of the Google searches. But I think that means we as a designer have done a good job. The client wanted something that was recognizable, something which was memorable. We didn't want to do anything which was a cliche or pastiche. And we really enjoyed designing it. I say that was designed on my kitchen table during COVID. And
Oh, wow. I want my break time to be as productive as yours.
it shows you the sort of the wonders now of technology, whereby we can have engineers in the other hemisphere doing bathymetric surveys. We can do LiDAR data. We can get that digital information. We can take that onto our computers here in the UK, in our offices in London. We can build our building information management systems. We did a lot of presentations via Zoom, Teams, and the original sketch for the cetacean was drawn on my, say, kitchen table, photographed in WhatsApp, sent
Wow.
to my colleague in Australia who was presenting, who then just literally within 30 seconds was able to share the image on a video conferencing call, and the client bought into that. And that's how we've been working. It's strange. Everybody feels that you have to be in the office space, but I think digital technology allows us to do a great deal without having to build up that massive carbon footprint of traveling around the world. I haven't had to come and visit you in Colombia, but we're chatting to each other as if we're on the other side of the table. Yeah. And yesterday, I joined a conversation which was run by UN Habitat. So it was looking at the global housing crisis. It was an NGO for the United Nations. And, we had people there talking from Pakistan, colleagues and clients in New York, and everybody sharing ideas about how we deal with this climate emergency, and how we can provide affordable homes for people in very vulnerable flood situations. So technology, I think, has enabled us to understand the urgency and to share some very compelling ideas. Yeah. And yesterday there was some wonderful, a company called Mighty Build in California, who have now got this fantastic 3D printed buildings, and that will soon enable people in even the remotest areas to have warm, modern, prefabricated buildings without necessarily needing to have the skill set to deliver it. So our built environment will change. I think we just need to ask the right questions and empower our politicians to create the opportunities to be able to deliver this type of infrastructure and buildings.
Yeah, and to that point, what do you think is needed to not just get the conversation going, but to legitimize more and more and more that this is a good solution to certain pressing problems that we have? Is it political capital? Is it financial resources? More case studies that showcase what?
Well, one of the things which was said in this debate at the UN yesterday was that a lot of architects, designers, contractors find building codes and building regulations, all the changes to them, incredibly slow. I think one of the quotes, let me just check my notes here, was that it was enshrined in blood, or let me just find the right phrase, because it's just bear with me. Oh yeah, no, the building codes are written in blood.
Yeah.
And so, you know, if you look at the tech world, they have gone back to first principles and have put their products out there or their social media without any government intervention. And almost it's like governments are trying now to regulate that in reverse.
Yes.
Whereas the built environment is born out of 20th century thinking.
Oh, yes.
So those rules, regulations are incredibly cumbersome. And so, for example, when we wanted to build the Amphibious House, and also like the gentleman was talking about 3D printing, we were constrained to part innovating, but most of it reusing conventional materials, be it from bridge building technology or the marine environment, and repurposing them. Whereas the best solutions would be to develop a piece of engineering design fit for purpose.
Yeah.
But there's no building codes to regulate it.
Yes.
So then you can't get insurance.
Yes. Yeah. Or a mortgage.
So we presented yesterday the notion of something called an innovation license.
Oh.
So the innovation license would allow the built environmental professionals to make a big step forward. So if essentially it encourages the private sector to invest in their built environment and their employees who live and work in their properties. And so, for example, say you took a big employer. It could be a car manufacturer. So you could assume that also that they provide housing for their employees, I should say. So they would then pitch to the government to say, look, we'd like to do this to net zero carbon. But some of the regulations are tricky to get around. So we want to go back to first principles and we'd like to develop this. So they put a proposition together to the local planning authority or the local governing body for a special permit, a license. And they lay claim to what this would achieve. So as I say, we mentioned zero carbon. It could be cleaner air. It could be a COVID pandemic proof school. And then the local authority would grant that business a permit, but also with that permit, they get tax breaks. So, you know, they rather than paying, you know, contribution to a school or a new road, that money can go in the product development, whether it's prefabrication within that idea, that development. So they get this license, and it's independently audited as well from another institution. So everybody says, yes, in principle, this works. So then they get their passport to license, so that they get to build. So over the next couple of years, they do the drawings, they do the build. And at the end of that process, there's an audit. So has your product or idea or building lived up to that performance criteria that you set out? And if it does, they get to keep the benefits of the tax breaks.
Oh, cool.
And then from a governance perspective, you then have to set out, well, what were the obstacles for delivery? So you go, well, this policy would have been, you know, if we'd have followed this to the letter, we couldn't have done that. So then the government has the chance to then go, okay, we have a benchmark building now. If we change this regulation, we can enable more buildings, but equally, you've got a case study that people can refer to. So in the round, say 10 licenses are granted per city. Well, you could probably assume that 2 or 3 will fail, but several of these will succeed, or at the very least, we will learn lessons from them. So that could work really well. And then in the event that they fail, you say, well, either you have a choice of paying back the tax breaks, or you make retrospective changes to your building to bring it back to code level.
Okay.
So there's it's effectively, it's a framework for really pushing forward development. But you can imagine, the likes of a Google building a new campus, or, a car manufacturer building, a floating factory,
yes.
or building, a large block of affordable homes, which could start off as student accommodation for an Olympics, which is then repurposed to become affordable homes somewhere else. All these different opportunities, which under normal circumstances would be very challenging to build. And it would just accelerate change. So within the next 5 to 10 years, you could have some very transformative developments. But, unless we do that, these could be 30, 40, 50 years away.
Yes. Yeah, it's telling, it always comes down to regulations. People really think floating or amphibious, it's only just about the engineering, the architecture, the design, but the legal and the technical go like this, because I'm sure you've also encountered that, and touching on the point of getting insurance. If you have a floating home in a place that doesn't have regulations for floating home, only has immobile property and boats, then the floating home is in an in-between space. And then, so it always comes down to regulation. And I really like that idea. I think it incentivizes private companies to innovate with new regulations by pushing what already exists and by getting tax advantages. I think it ticks the 3 things. Yeah, I love it. And I'm sure, and the sustainability. So it just sustainability, taxes, new regulations, and innovation. I think that's the 4 things we need, no? To make the world, well, more, but to make the world at least a bit better. I like that.
Thank you.
I love it. Okay, well, Richard, thank you so much for talking to me this time. And I've learned a lot. It's been very interesting. And I'm sure our listeners and viewers also find it very interesting. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.